Hello and welcome to Hey Ask Me Stuff, the show where you out there in the internet land get to ask me stuff. My name is Ken Coughlin. I am a Christian apologist coming at you from Trinity Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. If this is your first time joining us, let me tell you what the show is all about. This show is entirely viewer driven, where you out there in the audience get to submit questions that are then kind of compiled by the team here. And each week we pick a question that has been submitted by a viewer in order to answer that question on the air. If you want to get your question on a future episode of Hey Ask Me Stuff, here's how you do it. Go to that website that is on the screen, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. When you get to that website, you will find a form that you can fill out to submit your question. And it can be anything. I mean, we're talking about, anything that's related to kind of what our channel is all about, right? This is a church channel. So if you have questions about the Bible, about Jesus, about God, about world religions, about, the Bible's take on popular social issues of the day, anything like that, throw it in there. Go ahead, put it in the question, submit that form, and who knows, maybe you'll see your question get answered on a future episode of Hey Ask Me Stuff. So there's more than ways than just submitting questions. You can participate. If you are watching us live, we are live every Thursday at 6:30, or every Tuesday. It's not Thursday, it's Tuesday. Whatever. Okay, they all run together. I was joking around with Pastor Reese earlier today that, happy whatever day it is, because sometimes they all just run together. That's my excuse. So every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time here on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. And if you are watching us live, I invite you to go ahead and comment in the live chat. If I say something tonight you agree with, disagree with, if you have a question about something I talk about, throw it there in the live chat. Your question will appear on the screen, and I will also be able to see it over here, and we can actually interact and we can respond. If you are not watching it live, you're watching after the fact, still want to hear what you think, throw your comment down there in the comments section. And who knows? Those of you that watched the show last week know that last week's entire show was responding to comments from the previous week's show. So maybe we can still interact that way, depending on how the schedule works out and what we end up doing. So thank you very much for joining us. Hey, if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel here. We are approaching, I can't remember exactly what number we're at. I want to say 1584. So we're getting close to 1,600 subscribers. We do have a goal where we want to get to 2,000. So help us get to 2,000. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends about it. Tell your family about it. Tell them to subscribe too. We greatly appreciate it. And like the video, comment, all that jazz. You know all that whole drill goes. All right, so what are we going to do today? What are we going to be talking about? We are going to be talking about what is a miracle. That's the short version of it. The question that was actually submitted had kind of two parts to it. It was, number one was, how do you recognize a miracle? What makes something a miracle? How do you know when a miracle's happened? And also, does God still do miracles today? So that is what we are going to be talking about on today's show. First, I'm going to take a little bit of time to define what we in the Christian faith mean by a miracle, and then talk about whether or not God actually does miracles today, or did that all close off with the close of canon, with the close of the scriptures? And then at the end, I'm going to throw in a little bonus where I'm going to talk about a couple of the leading arguments that people present against miracles. Obviously, there's plenty of people in the world today who don't think miracles can ever happen. Why not? We're going to look at a couple of those arguments and see if that really holds up. Can you really honestly, logically say that miracles are impossible? Miracles can't happen. We hear that all the time. We're going to look at a little bit a few of those at the end of this end of the episode. So, all right. So, without further ado, let's dive right into this, shall we? We are going to go into the first question. What is a miracle? And I'm getting this definition that you see on the screen from a book on my shelf that I read in seminary. I think it's a great book. It's by R. Douglas Givett. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Gary Habermas. That one I know. Gary Habermas is a very well-known theologian. The name of the book is In Defense of Miracles, and it has a subtitle. I can't remember what it is. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this section where we're talking about defining miracles actually does come from this book. So if you're interested and you want to dive deeper, grab the book, read the book. All right. Here's how they define a miracle in the opening of their book. They say a miracle is an event in which God temporarily makes an exception to the natural order of things to show that God is acting. Well, there's actually kind of two parts but actually, before I get to that, let me distinguish what we mean by this, because there's a lot of different ways that people use this term miracle. I remember I taught a class, I can't remember why I was teaching about miracles, but it was part of a larger class a few years back. And it was right after Justin Tucker. Actually, I think this was last. I think it was last football season. Now I think about it, Justin Tucker had just made the NFL record field goal distance, and Justin Tucker's the kicker for the Ravens. And somebody out there, if you're watching, you can tell me how long the field goal was. If you know, I don't remember how long the field goal was, but it was the longest one ever kicked in NFL history. And it like doinked off. I remember it was against the Detroit Lions, and it kind of hit the crossbar and then bounced in. And of course, the announcers at the time were like ranting and raving. And there was actually I can't remember who put it, like a Twitter post afterwards, when the title, the subline or whatever of that Twitter post with the link to the article about this kick was, "Do you believe in miracles?" And so a lot of people will look at things like that and say that was a miracle. We use that word an awful lot. So I want to make sure we're clear on our language here. There's two other ways that people will often use the term miracle, but that's not what I'm talking about here. And that's not, I guess, not truly what we mean by a miracle. One, the better term for it is providence. Providence is just God working through the natural order of things to bring about his will. All right. In other words, God, we all know that, God he already knows what's going to happen at the end of time, right? He's got the ending written. If you don't know what it is, read the book of Revelation, all right? And some of Daniel. It's all in there. And so he works within the natural order of things, just the regular progression of events, nothing particularly supernatural about it, to kind of bring about that end. And that is called providence. It's just God working through natural mechanisms, all right, within the natural world, the boundaries, the laws, the constants of the natural world. He works within those to bring about certain results. Another way that sometimes we might use the term miracle, which is not really what I'm talking about, is what the authors of the book I'm referring to, they refer to it as direct, non-miraculous intervention. Now, this is one where it's not just kind of God generally trying to bring about his plan, but God is now answering a specific request. He's granting a specific request. You have prayed for something, all right, and God is answering that prayer. He's saying, yep, here you go. All right, of course, we know not all answers to prayer are yes, right? Okay. My wife likes to say sometimes God says yes, sometimes he says no, sometimes he says, you've got to be kidding me. But some of these times when God says yes, it is still a direct, whatever action he takes is still directly responsive to a request that was made of him. But again, the mechanism that he used to bring about that result is still non-miraculous. It's still working within the natural order of things. Now, it may seem statistically, wow, what the odds of that happening? And that's how we as Christians can often recognize God, at work, when it's like, okay, I made a specific request, and then against all odds, that particular request ended up happening. Even if I can't necessarily point to a violation of the natural law that was at play there, that alone is enough for me, when I already have my belief in my relationship with God, to say, okay, I see what God did there. All right. But that, again, is not really what we're talking about here when we're talking about miracles, and not what this definition of miracles is talking about. There's two parts. I want to break down this definition of miracles from this book that I gave you. All right. And the first part of the definition is that a miracle is an exception to the natural order of things. So there's a natural order, and then there's an exception to it. All right, something that happens outside of that natural order that some people will say violate the natural order. Now, what should be clear just by looking at this first part of the definition is that in order to recognize when something is an exception to the natural order, we first have to recognize, acknowledge that there is a natural order, and recognize what that natural order is. All right, and sometimes you might hear the word natural laws. I mean, there clearly is a natural order to this universe. All right, there are laws and constants that govern or describe, we'll talk about that in a minute, how it operates. All right. There's gravity, for example. There's a law of gravity. So there is a natural order of the way things generally operate within this universe. And so having that natural order, then a miracle is when there's an exception to that natural order. When something happens that is not within that natural order, that is not explained by that natural order of things. Now, one objection you hear sometimes is you say that, ancient people were, they didn't know the natural order. They didn't know the laws of physics. They were far pre-Newton and certainly knew nothing about quantum mechanics. And so they were just really, really quick to jump to the miracle excuse. But it wasn't necessarily their fault. It was just out of their ignorance. They didn't know, they didn't understand the natural order. So they would automatically say, oh, it's a miracle. Oh, that's a miracle. Oh, that's a miracle. Look at all the miracles all around us. And here's the response that I have for those who say that. But I hate to break it to you, but even thousands of years ago, people understood that dead bodies tended to stay dead. They understood that if they threw something up in the air, it came back down. Okay. They may not have been able to conceptualize all of this in certain mathematical formulas to the degree that, Einstein's helped us to do and others have helped us to do to this day. But that doesn't mean they didn't understand that there was a natural order and what that natural order was to be able to recognize when something was an exception to that natural order. They weren't a bunch of gullible people, all right? And so it doesn't take a degree in astrophysics to understand what the natural order is. Just like I guarantee you there's people that are watching this program that do not have a degree in astrophysics or any of those higher degrees. You still know what the natural order is. You still know that dead bodies tend to stay dead, all right? All right, so that's the first part of the definition. But there's a second part that I think is key. We all kind of seem to grasp that first part of that definition, and that's, if I were to ask a lot of you out there, what is a miracle? I'd be willing to bet most of you would give me some kind of response that's similar to that first part. But the second part is crucial. The second part says that it is to show that God is acting. I'll give you some biblical references here to back this up in a minute. Understand this. Miracles have a purpose. Every miracle we see in the Bible served a purpose. God does not do miracles merely for the sake of doing miracles. He does not do them because he's bored one morning and says, hey, I want to watch something fun. The Father pokes the Holy Spirit and say, hey, you want to see something funny? Let me watch as I do this, and then do some miracle just for the fun of it. Which, by the way, is also one key way you can kind of distinguish, aside from any numerous other factors you can use to distinguish, the true biblical writings, the true gospels, from some of the Gnostic gospels and the heretical gospels that came up in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, because you do see a lot of miracle claims in those other non-canonical books that serve no purpose whatsoever. I mean, it's really just, some of them almost make God just look, vindictive, frivolous, whatever, what have you. And they don't, the miracles that you see in those books, described in those books, don't kind of fit the same pattern. Now, again, the Gevet and Habermas, what they point out is every miracle we see in the Bible has not just a purpose, but we can identify what that purpose is. The purpose is either to create or to confirm faith. That's the reason behind these miracles. Let me show you a couple of verses. There's a lot we could go through, but a couple of verses to illustrate this point. John chapter 14, verse 11. This is Jesus talking, trying to tell people to, hey, pay attention to what he has to say and to believe what he is saying. And he says, believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Or else believe on account of the works themselves. Understand, Jesus was going around healing people, changing water into wine, raising people from the dead. And what he's saying here is, look, you should just believe me based on what I'm telling you. But even if that's not enough, look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm doing. I'm doing work that only God can do. Jesus is God. That's another topic for another podcast, maybe. And so it verifies and it provides, the reason he's doing these miracles is to demonstrate the veracity of what he is claiming, the truth of what he is claiming, and who his identity is. And so the miracles are intended to show people who he is so that they will have faith in him. All right. Another example, one that you probably are familiar with, is from the book of Exodus, chapter 7, verse 17. This is at the very beginning of the plagues, before the plagues of Egypt begin, when God told Moses in the burning bush, go to Pharaoh, say, let my people go. And then here's what it says in verse 17. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. All right, so this is the kind of the precursor to all the plagues of Egypt, but the precursor to one of the plagues anyway. But this is kind of a recurring theme we see throughout the plagues of Egypt, these miraculous plagues that God brought down upon the nation of Egypt. He keeps saying, the reason this is happening is so that you will know I am the Lord. All right. Again, it's to create or to confirm or to strengthen faith. That's the purpose God is doing that. He's not just doing these things willy-nilly. He's doing them so that people will believe in him. That's the point. Now, here's an important line of distinction here. Does that mean that if that's the purpose, the purpose of these miracles is to create faith or to build faith, to reinforce faith? Does that mean every single time any person sees a miracle, they're automatically going to believe? No, no, it does not mean that. I mean, obviously, the number one example I can give you this is the same one we were just talking about. It's Pharaoh, right? Did Pharaoh, after the first plague happened, turn around and say, you know what? You're right. We're good. All the Israelite people, you can go. No, he didn't say that, right? He hardened his heart. And then and this is what it says in Exodus chapter 8, verses 15. This particular reference is after the plague of the frogs. God brought the frogs. Pharaoh said, please, please, please take the frogs away, and I'll let your people go. Moses prayed to God. God let get rid of the frogs. And as soon as the frogs were all gone, what happened? Pharaoh changed his tune, and this is what he said. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, meaning the frogs were all gone, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. The Lord said this was going to happen, and this is exactly what happened. Pharaoh hardened his heart. All right. And then if you look at the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, in telling that parable, look what Jesus says here, Luke 16:31. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. All right. So why is that? Why is it possible then, if I'm saying in one breath that, the purpose of these miracles is to create faith or to reinforce faith? How is it possible then that are we saying that God is ineffective? No, we're not saying that. Because keep in mind, the purpose, for example, of the plagues in Egypt, while God did say the purpose was so that you will know I am the Lord, doesn't necessarily mean Pharaoh was the target of that. Doesn't mean, we know that Pharaoh wasn't the target of that in that sense, because God told Moses from the beginning that Pharaoh was going to harden his heart and that Pharaoh wasn't going to believe, right? So who was it for? Well, everybody else who was seeing it, right? There were, first of all, before the Israelites, to reassure them that God is on their side. He is the one true God, and they are his chosen people and all that, which is a recurring theme when they get out into the wilderness, and God keeps saying, this is why they celebrate Passover year over year, to say, hey, remember what I did for you. This is God saying, remember what I did for you in Egypt. And so we can certainly see at a minimum that the performance of these miracles to this day is a reminder of faith, and to have faith and the importance of faith to the Jewish people, and by extension to us Christian people as well. So just because everybody doesn't come to faith through seeing these miracles doesn't mean nobody has their faith strengthened or reinforced or created through these miracles. That's a whole discussion about grace, that God can use his grace however he wants to. All right. So those are the two elements of what a miracle is. All right. It's an exception to the natural order of things, and it has a purpose, and the purpose is to create faith in someone or to strengthen faith in someone along those lines. Now, understanding then that is what the biblical concept of a miracle is, we have the other part of that question that was asked of me, which is, does God still continue to do miracles today? And I think the easiest way to answer that question is to look at that definition. All right, we had two parts of that definition. Let's ask ourselves, do these still hold true today? Because, look, there are some things we have to admit, that don't hold true today. You look at the Old Testament, there's a whole sacrificial system set up there that we should not be going back to. We don't need to sacrifice animals anymore. Why? Because we have the perfect sacrifice through Jesus. There's something else in the Bible that theologically trumps those old commands, right? And so, but let's look at the definition of these miracles and ask, is there anything, or these two parts of the definition of a miracle, is there anything that trumps these, theologically or otherwise? Number one, we talked about being an exception to the natural order of things. Is God still capable of making an exception to the natural order of things? Sure he is. Is there anything wrong with him doing that? No. There's like theologically wrong with him making an exception to the natural order of things today. I mean, after all, he is the creator of all things, right? If anyone is going to be able to make an exception to the laws of nature, it would be the person who created those laws of nature in the first place. If he made them, he can make different ones. He can temporarily say, you know what? For the next 2 seconds, this law is not going to be the law. Instead, I'm going to make this law be the law. And then we'll go back to the old law again. I mean, if he made it the first time, he can make it a second time, right? And then he can make it go back. So there's certainly no reason why God cannot continue to make exceptions to the natural order of things. Number two, is God still bringing people to faith or strengthening their faith? Yeah, of course he is. And so now lots of ways we do that is actually even looking through the past miracles. You look at the resurrection of Jesus Christ being the miracle of all miracles, obviously. And that is something that obviously God uses to bring people to faith. But is he still involved in this bringing you to faith business? Sure he is. All right. And so clearly, once we break it down by the elements, those two elements, there's no reason why God cannot continue to bring people to continue to do miracles today. The two parts of the definition still make perfect sense today. So, plus, as a kind of a side note, I would say that there are many, many people who I think have very credible claims to having witnessed miracles today. And I don't just mean the providence or the non-miraculous direct intervention like I talked about earlier in the show. I mean, there are plenty of claims of whether it be healings or what have you that just defy any other logical explanation. Of course, a naturalist would say, well, maybe we just don't understand what happened there. But that's you just assuming your naturalism or presupposing your naturalism. If you are convinced that God does in fact exist and God is capable of doing miracles, then it certainly becomes a very reasonable explanation for a lot of these events that, yeah, God miraculously intervened to create that healing or something like that. Does that mean that we should always count on God to do a miracle to get us out of whatever boat we're in? No. And the reason for that is, remember what I said before, the second part of that definition. Miracles have a purpose, all right? And when and how to use miracles to create faith or to build up someone's faith, that's a decision that's left up to God. God knows best when to do that. God can't do that all the time. All right. If miracles happened every 5 minutes, then we would no longer be able to recognize miracles when they happen. The whole point of a miracle, the whole power of a miracle is precisely because it is an exception. If it is an exception, then there has to be a rule. The rule has to be the norm. That way we will be able to recognize when an exception to the rule has occurred. If every single day is nothing more than exception after exception after exception after exception, then we will no longer be able to recognize a miracle because miracles will be the norm. All right. And so that's why we have to leave that to God, and we have to trust God to say when miracles should happen and when they shouldn't. All right. In the few minutes we got left here, what I want to do is I'm going to talk about, obviously there's a lot of people in the world today who don't believe miracles happen. More than that, they would say that it's impossible for miracles to happen. Miracles are impossible. And so I'm going to point out a few of the more common and more popular arguments that folks present to try to defend this position, to say miracles are impossible, or a slightly softer version of it would be, we are never justified, logically speaking, we're never justified in believing a miracle happened. So even if one did happen, we should never believe it. The first and probably most famous version of this is by philosopher David Hume. Now, David Hume wrote at a time when, you go back and you read some of these old philosophy books like Hume, like Kant, and I kind of wish, and I know I'm spoiled and probably just a creature of my own era, but I'm spoiled by the fact that, when philosophers today write, they tend to write out their arguments in numbered premises and a conclusion. The classic philosophers really didn't do that. Not so much. They would lots of times just write in paragraph form or something. And so it's kind of left to us to kind of decipher, okay, break down that paragraph into premises and conclusions. Well, David Hume's argument against miracles is one of those situations. And the result has been that there's been some disagreement about exactly how he meant to formulate this. And there's been two versions of his argument, what we might call a hard version and a soft version, that have been presented. The hard version is would be represented by these premises and conclusion I have on the screen. The hard version says this: premise one, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Premise two, we have uniform experience that the laws of nature are never violated. Conclusion, therefore, miracles cannot occur. I wonder if anybody can recognize the problem with that right off the bat. The hard version is not very popular nowadays for very good reason. I mean, even most skeptics will not try to present the hard version of David Hume's argument. And that's because premise two commits a logical fallacy called question begging. Look at what Hume says in premise two. We have uniform experience that the laws of nature are never violated. I could rephrase that to say that we have 100% certainty that miracles never happen. I mean, that's basically what he says. Uniform experience, meaning complete, total experience without exception, that the laws of nature are never violated. That's a miracle, right? He literally just smuggles his conclusion into his second premise. Right? He just states it as if it were already a known fact. Well, what about all those people who claim they have witnessed a miracle? All right. Hume, like I said, Hume just assumes his conclusion there in premise two. That's why that's called question begging. You haven't proven anything. You just stated it, kind of reworded it a little bit as one of the premises of your conclusion, and then turned around and said, look what I proven. What I prove? Well, no, you didn't prove it. You assumed it earlier on. Another point I mentioned earlier that I said we'd come back to is a problem there with premise one. Premise one says a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And you'll notice the definition I gave you talked about it being an exception to the natural order of things. When people like to use this terminology, violation of the laws of nature, it raises an interesting question of what do you mean by that? What are the laws of nature? Are the laws of nature what we call descriptive, or are they prescriptive? I will spoil it tell you if you read Hume. Hume ends up describing the laws of nature as descriptive. What that means is the laws themselves don't determine anything. They're just descriptions of what happens. All right. So the law of it's not the law of gravity does not make things fall the way they fall. It's just us coming up with a description of what actually happens. We see something, it falls in a certain way, and we describe how it fell. And that's all the law of nature is. It's just a description. Whereas prescription, when we say the laws are prescriptive, we're saying they actually do govern. So it's the law of gravity makes something fall the way it falls. The reason that's important is because Hume defines the laws of nature as descriptive, just descriptions. And isn't that convenient? Because that allows him to just literally, through the stroke of his pen, explain away any miracles. Because what would happen if the laws are nothing but descriptions of what happens? Then what would happen if someone did rise from the dead? Well, we just write another law to describe it. We just describe it, right? And the mere fact that we're describing it means it is natural. It's just a new law of nature that maybe we didn't know before, but now we describe it happening, and therefore we just add this new law of nature to our group of natural laws, to our group of descriptions. And so literally nothing can ever be a violation of the law of nature, because the moment you see something you think might be a violation, you just create a new law of nature to bring it under the umbrella of the laws of nature. I mean, that's what Hume does. And so that's another problem with his argument, and really not just the hard form of the argument. All right. Whereas the Christian understanding is the laws are prescriptive. What we say there is, look, no, God created this universe. And at the time he created this universe, he imposed certain laws upon it that would govern the way it operates, just like a machine, right? You have certain gears and pulleys that govern how a machine is going to work. That's what the laws of nature do. God put these laws in place to determine how the universe was going to operate. Not how people operate. People are something different. We are not part of the mechanics of the universe. Again, that's a conversation for another day. But the universe itself is governed by these prescriptive laws. All right, so that's the problem with the hard version of his argument. This is the soft version of the argument. This is the one that's really more popular today. People try to basically give Hume the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, he wasn't advocating, he wasn't question begging, he wasn't literally putting his conclusion into his second premise. He was saying something more like this. He was saying a miracle is, by definition, a rare occurrence. Check. We agree with him so far, right? Absolutely. I just said that, right? That a miracle can't be happening every 2 seconds. Otherwise, the exception becomes the norm, and now there's no way to recognize an exception. Premise number 2, natural law is, by definition, a description of regular occurrences. And this is where you start to see his terminology about a description. No, we don't agree it's a description of regular occurrences. It is a prescription that defines the regular occurrences, that mandates the regular occurrences. But we see where he's going here. Premise 3, the evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. Premise 4, a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. I mean, why wouldn't you, right? Conclusion, therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Again, I was interrupting a lot, so I'm going to read that again straight through. Premise 1, a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. Premise 2, natural law is by definition a description of regular occurrences. Premise 3, the evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. Premise 4, a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Conclusion, therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. What's the problem with the argument? Well, I already kind of hinted at one, which I won't go into too much, and that's, you see where he smuggles in the difference between natural law being descriptive versus prescriptive. But here's the big one, all right? Hume commits a logical fallacy called equivocation, all right? Equivocation is a big, fancy philosophical term that just means you changed the definition of one of your terms, one of your words, in the middle of your argument, all right? It's subtle, it's sometimes hard to recognize, but let's take a look at how he did this. Look at premise 3. The evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. All right. What does that mean? Well, that means that, if you have a regular occurrence that happens a bazillion times and a rare occurrence that happens 2 times, and you were to add up, all right, how many instances of the regular do I have versus how many instances of the rare do I have? Well, I'm always going to have more instances of the regular, more observations of the regular than I'm ever going to have of observations of the rare, correct? So in this situation, in this premise, when he uses that word greater, he's speaking of quantity of evidence, the quantity of evidence. You will always have more instances of evidence of the regular than you will have instances of evidence of the rare. By nature of what those are. The regular is what's happening more often, right? Now look at what he does in premise 4 and the subtle shift he makes. A wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Does greater in that premise mean quantity? Is it true that a wise man always bases his belief on whatever evidence he has more instances of? No. What Hume has done here is he has shifted the meaning of the term greater from referring to quantity to referring to quality, how good the evidence is, how strong the evidence is, the high quality of evidence. A wise man certainly does always base his belief on the greater quality evidence, the more persuasive evidence. But that does not necessarily mean that the wise man always bases his belief on the greater number of instances of evidence. I'll give you one very clear example that should clear this up very obviously, and that's the lottery, all right? Let's say that you have a winning lottery ticket. Well, let's follow Hume's reasoning here, okay? What is more regular? What is more common? Having a losing lottery ticket or having a winning lottery ticket? I mean, obviously, the nature of the lottery is that it is far more common, it is more regular to have a losing lottery ticket than it is to have a winning lottery ticket. And so if we were to use the term greater, which one of those two propositions, you have a winning ticket, you have a losing ticket, which of those two propositions has the greater evidence for it when we use the term greater meaning quantity? It would be that you have a losing ticket, right? Well, that means then, if we are consistent and we just use greater to mean quantity, that we should never believe that anyone ever has a winning lottery ticket. Because every single time someone claims to have a winning lottery ticket, there will always be far more instances of losing tickets than there will winning tickets. So following Hume's reasoning, we should never believe that they have a winning ticket. With that example in mind, is it true, is premise 4 true, that a wise man always bases his belief on the greater quantity, greater numerical amount of evidence? No, it is not true. A wise man always bases his belief on the greater quality of evidence. Quality can outweigh quantity. Using our lottery example, what would that mean? Well, number one, you got a ticket with the winning numbers on it. All right? You literally show a ticket. Look, here's the winning numbers. Here's the ticket. All right? That would be one instance where we can actually say, no, that's going to be the quality of that evidence than anything that we would get to from just even though it's overwhelmed in quantity by losing tickets. Also, other things we can do today. I mean, they can track, how often you hear about a winning lottery and it tells you 2 seconds later what store it was bought from, right? I mean, they have these machines now, so they can actually tell whether the ticket you're presenting to them was actually, a genuine ticket or not. Was it purchased through this machine at this location? Heck, they can even pull out surveillance footage and see if they can find you there buying the actual ticket. So there's a million ways that we can show a higher quality of evidence that can outweigh even the unlikely quantity unlikeliness if we were just to examine based on quantity. So that's where Hume's argument really goes wrong. The soft version messes up quality of evidence for quantity, changes the definition of the meaning of the term greater mid-flow. I'm going to give you one more here before we go. This is an argument that was presented by Antony Flew. Antony Flew was an atheist. He passed away, 13 years ago? He passed away in 2010. Leading atheistic philosopher who actually changed his mind. Now, he didn't become a Christian, to our knowledge, before he passed, but he did come to believe that God existed. He kind of disavowed his atheism. Now, the form of belief that he came to is that's what's called deism. He said that he believed that God existed and created the universe, but then has kind of left it to its own devices, that God does not interact with the universe after that moment of creation. Obviously, we as Christians disagree with that. God has interacted with the world quite a bit. But he created this argument against miracles in his atheist days, and frankly, he would still, I don't think he ever came to accept the belief in miracles, because again, he didn't believe that God intervened in the universe after he created it. Take a look based on what we've talked about with David Hume, see if you can recognize the flaw in Antony Flew's argument. Premise 1, miracles are by nature particular and repeatable. Oh, there's a typo there. I should say and repeatable. Some of the keys on my keyboard and my computer don't work very well. Sorry about that. Premise 2, natural events are by nature general and repeatable. Premise 3, in practice, the evidence for the general and repeatable is always greater than that for the particular and unrepeatable. Conclusion, therefore, in practice, the evidence will always be greater against miracles than for them. What's the problem? It's the exact same problem that Hume made, isn't it? That in midstream, Antony Flew here confuses quantity of evidence with quality of evidence. He used the same word, greater, to describe the two of them. For in practice, the evidence for the general, is premise 3, in practice, the evidence for the general and repeatable is always greater than that for the particular and unrepeatable. That is a true statement only if we're using that term greater to mean quantity of evidence. But then his conclusion, he says, therefore, in practice, the evidence will always be greater against miracles than for them. And what he's trying to imply there is greater in the sense of quality of evidence. If he uses greater in the sense of quantity of evidence, I'd agree with him in that conclusion. It's absolutely true. There will always be more instances where we can point to the regular happening than the irregular happening. That's kind of one of those, if that's all he means by that conclusion, then I guess the response is, well, duh. What it means for something to be regular and something to be rare. But obviously that's not what he means by that conclusion. He's trying to say that miracles can never actually happen. All right, so summing it all up, I think we've done that I don't want to get too philosophical. Plus, it's 7:09. We got to wrap this thing up. So summing it all up, the question that was originally asked for me is, what is a miracle? And a miracle, like we said, is something that it's an exception to the natural order of things. God has set up that natural order of things to govern how the universe operates. He did that at the time he created it. And because he made those laws that govern how it operates, he can make different laws. He can temporarily go in and say, okay, now the natural law for the next 2 seconds is going to be this instead of this. All right. So obviously he has the power and the ability to do that if he created the laws in the first place. But more so, we said biblically, a miracle is also, it has a purpose, and that purpose is pointing toward faith. It's granting people faith, or it's confirming faith or strengthening faith. All right. That's the purpose for which God does miracles. So if you want to evaluate an event today that happens, and that was the second part of the question, do miracles happen today? And I said, there's absolutely no reason to believe they don't. I mean, that definition certainly would allow for miracles to be happening today. The Bible certainly allows for miracles to be happening today. And keep in mind, miracles kept happening even in the book of Acts. So even after Jesus had ascended, miracles were still happening. So there's no reason to believe that miracles can't happen today. And I think there's a lot of credible stories of instances where people claim to have been the recipient of or the witness to a miracle, that I think that's frankly the best explanation for them. So yes, miracles can happen, and I think do happen today. And then we looked at a few examples of folks today that tried to say that miracles are impossible, to show how logically those arguments just don't hold up. They don't hold up. We, at a minimum, I think an authentic skeptic should, now a lot of them won't obviously, but I think they should at least be open to the possibility of miracles. If God does exist, and I know they don't think God does exist, but if God does exist, then they should be at least open to the possibility of miracles occurring. And then at least that gets us to the point where we can be talking about them on a case-by-case basis and evaluating the evidence for the miracles. If we can at least all agree that they're theoretically possible, now let's look at this particular instance and evaluate it to see if it actually is a miracle. And of course, we as Christians would be evaluating not just to see if there was an exception to the natural order of things, but also to see if it fits with that purpose. For example, something that happens that would tend to point away from God or from his revelation, that ain't from God. All right? That ain't from God. And so we need to keep in mind that second part of the definition. All right. Thank you very much, everybody who was watching here tonight. I really very much appreciate it. Just again, another reminder, we are on every Tuesday night at 6:30. If you are available, watch us live, interact. We'd love to talk with you. If you're not and you're watching it after the replay, put your comment down there in the comments section. And again, one last reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, why not? Please do. We're trying to reach that goal of 2,000 subscribers. We're getting there, and we're making a lot of rapid progress. I mean, there's a lot more on this YouTube channel than, dare I say, most churches. You might be looking at it and think, that's a church channel. I don't want to watch just a bunch of worship services. Well, number one, I think you should. We got some good ones, and worshiping God is the highest privilege we have. So we actually should be doing that. But, we also have, like, this podcast. We've got a lot of Bible studies and other classes on here. We've got a lot of YouTube shorts. YouTube really loves shorts. And so if you're really the kind of person that just, I've only got 1 minute to spare here, I want a concise point, maybe a 30 to 45 minute podcast isn't your thing, check out our shorts feed, and you can kind of get your dose of, we have some apologetic content on there. We have some, ministry type content on there. We have excerpts from sermons and other things on there. So check out the shorts feed. I think you'll get a kick out of that. And we have some other fun stuff too. We've got just some little fun and games things that we throw up there from time to time. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching us here this evening. I hope to see you all back next week. We'll be back next Tuesday at 6:30. God bless you all. See you then.